The prophet Isaiah begins by declaring that during this time of captivity and uncertainty, that God did in fact have a plan for Israel's future. She was to be restored, but his plan for restoration wasn't going to look like what society would have expected. God's got a plan. It was God's plan. It pleased the Lord, or it was God's good plan. God has a plan. We're in captivity. We're suffering through times of uncertainty. We're suffering times of political unrest. We're suffering questions about the judicial bench. We're suffering through questions of legislation and who's going to do what with what program. We're suffering through uncertain times, but God has a plan.
Yeah.
Israel was to be restored, but his plan for restoration did not look like what society would have expected in that day. One of the themes of the Bible is God's tendency to bless and deliver in ways that challenge the status quo and through the most unlikely of heroes. 9 times out of 10, you read through the Bible, the person that you would have expected to be the hero at the onset of the story ends up not being that person. That's not who God picks to move. 9 times out of 10, when God does move, it never meets the expectations of how things are supposed to go in society of that day. That's not how God works. The heroes of the scripture tend to be people that no one in their right mind would have chosen for such a role. I'm glad about that because it leaves me in the running. It leaves some of you in the running. Some of you are obvious picks. Some of you nobody would have picked. And God can pick who he wants to, but he does not disqualify any of us just because it's not what somebody else would have thought. God selects the inglorious, the weak, the barren, the ignoble, the broken, the exiled, the damaged, and the unremarkable to be his champions. He is the God of the reject.
Yes.
That's me. The God of the misfit.
Yes.
It's also me. God of the despised. That might be me depending on how you talk to. God does remarkable things with broken people.
Yes, he does.
I'm so glad that God does remarkable things with broken people, because that means he can still use me. That means he can still use you.
Yes. Yes.
Thank you, sir. God advances his agenda in the earth through vessels that will challenge observers to see past their preconceived ideas of how the world is supposed to work and recognize the sovereignty and the glory of an all-wise God. He picks ways and picks people. The suffering servant that nobody wants to look at, that nobody would ever put up on a political ad and campaign, he picks to be his servant to restore the people through suffering. It doesn't make sense. Even today, the notion of deliverance that may require suffering is a hard sell for preachers. It's not we want to shout over the deliverance that's coming, the breakthrough that's coming, but we never tend to mention in the same sermon, because we don't want to get in the way of people shouting, that you might have to suffer to get there.
Yeah.
These days, it's rare to hear one talk about taking up your cross during the call to discipleship. We want to see folks get saved and baptized. They can find out about the suffering when they get there. For now, just come on, get saved, get baptized. We can, and then you can be delivered. When the suffering hits, we'll deal with that later. We're not going to talk about taking up a cross, because the notion of being delivered from suffering through suffering just does not make sense.
No. No.
How do you put that together? As with the suffering servant, when God's plan doesn't look like what we think it is, we tend to reject it.